Good afternoon, viewers. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach the Modern European History paper at Hindu College, University of Delhi. And today, I welcome you to this series on European history. And the topic that we would be talking about today is the historical context of the scientific revolution in Europe. As you all know, that the time period that I am specifically referring to with respect to this particular phenomena that we understand as scientific revolution is that of 17th century Europe. And as the topic says, it is the historical context that we are trying to explore. So, of course, we would go back and we would go back several centuries in the history of Europe in order to understand the historical anchorage of whatever happened around 17th century, 18th century, or for that matter the last half of 16th century in Europe, where you have a galaxy of scientists, where you have a galaxy of scientific theories being propounded, soon followed by what we also understand as technological revolution immediately preceding the iconic industrial revolution in the last quarter of the 18th century. So, that is the agenda for today's discussion. Now, the best way to enter into this topic as a student of history is to enter it through the debate amongst the historians about the nature of the scientific revolution, or you can also understand it with respect to the causation of the scientific revolution. This phenomena is understood by historians, is studied by historians and sociologists as compared to generally what the scientists think about this. The scientists generally think about these developments in the context of individualized, isolated brilliance of person associated, for example, Newton, Galileo, Copernicus and so forth, René Descartes and so forth. And they don't quite give much credence to the actual historical context, the socio-political climate, the intellectual climate, or the political necessities which provided some kind of a push or created a kind of environment in which such a phenomena could occur. As opposed to this, we have a set of historians and sociologists who rather take the view of scientific revolution as having happened in the context of what was happening in 16th century, 15th century or 17th century Europe with respect to its political changes, with respect to its economic transformation, with respect to what Renaissance and Reformation had triggered, what the Enlightenment scholars were talking about. And there are so many other historical correlates, the coordinates, the historical coordinates. It is within that historical coordinate that they try and understand this phenomena of scientific revolution, so far as historians and sociologists are concerned. So, we shall try to see as to how the things unfolded. Now, the isolationist understanding of the scientific developments in the 17th century was first countered effectively by Charles Webster, as you can see on your slide. And thereafter, you have a series of scholars like A.C. Crombie, Claggett, etc., who rather looked at the progressive aspects of scientific developments. When I say progressive aspects of scientific developments, what you need to keep in mind is the anchorage of whatever was happening in 17th century in what had already happened in 15th century, 16th century Europe, and there was some kind of an incremental directional change that was happening, and that was happening with a sense of direction. There is a certain tangent that you can see through this, and the status quo of the 15th century or 16th century was deliberately broken. And that is how it is like standing on the shoulders of the previous innovators and scientists that the iconic scientists of 16th and 17th century Europe actually delivered. So, that is the basic idea that these scholars try to put across. and that includes this the range of scholars that I just spoke of includes several Marxist historians also, like Boris Hessen, Edward Zilseth, as you can see on your slide. And these historians have emphasized the historical circumstance, the historical context in which these scientific innovations and theorizations and methodological elaborations became the mainstream way of acquiring knowledge. So they speak of the needs of the bourgeoisie, which all of us know that by around 16th century, in Europe, bourgeoisie as a social group was coming in a big way. It was having a lot of economic muscle. It was trying to influence the upcoming absolutist monarchies, particularly in the western part of Europe. Similarly, the feudal breakdown is emphasized by Edward Zilseth. And he says that feudal breakdown in Europe around 15th, 16th centuries also led to unleashing of several you can say mindset, attitudes, and it created a kind of intellectual climate that was very individualized and goal oriented, and that is what led to these innovations. Even Engels and Christopher Hill, who are also iconic Marxist scholars, they also by and large subscribe to the same idea that there is this historical social context in which this phenomena of scientific revolution is to be understood. Now, moving beyond the range of scholars and their viewpoints, if you really look at the series of events that characterizes the history of, say 15th century, 16th century, 17th century Europe, then the major points are scholasticism, which hit Europe prior to Renaissance, then Renaissance itself, Reformation, the coming of the absolutist monarchies, particularly in the western part of Europe and also in the eastern part, although it was by consolidating the feudal roots that absolutism arose in the central and eastern part of Europe. Then the range of overseas discoveries. We have sea voyages being undertaken, which were financed by the upcoming absolutist monarchs or the merchants or the bourgeoisie. So that had also a role to play. The coming of the commercial capital. Commercial capitalism emerges at around this time, 16th century, 17th century in Europe, and gradually it with the coming of the industrial revolution, it acquired the form of industrial capital or industrial capitalism. But prior to that, the capital that was generated was basically going to commercial enterprise, basically going to trade enterprise, basically going to these overseas voyages and a little bit of trade that they were doing, and it is through that they were trying to earn profits. And of course, the list also includes the intellectual climate characterized by the writings of the Enlightenment scholars in the second half of the 17th century and first half of 18th century. So, moving beyond this, what we get to see that if we look at the overall scenario with respect to changes or forces unleashed by these events, these phenomena, then we find that all these phenomena significantly altered and in fact it reset the intellectual compass of Europe, within which the scientific efflorescence of 17th century needs to be understood. And when we say scientific efflorescence of 17th century Europe, what we have in mind is the unfolding of the range of scientific methodologies. This is not to say that scientificity is something that eluded medieval times or the ancient times or the classical Greece period and so forth. Aristotle and several other classical Greek scholars were revered personalities even in 16th and 17th centuries. But what I mean here is that the range of methodology or methodological you can say procedures that characterizes scientific exploration, that had come to its full blown form. So, you do not only have observation with which any intellectual inquiry begins, which gave rise to empiricism, you also had experimentation. So, you recreated the situation and demonstrated it, and thereafter more critical than the first two, because traces of the first two could be had even in the earlier period. It is the formulation. So, whatever was observed or experimented with ultimately had to be formulated in some kind of a law, some kind of a natural law, some kind of an invariable cause effect kind of argument, which is invariant, which has a pattern, and which can withstand the change of time, space, and despite that it holds true. So, that kind of generalization is something which was sought to be arrived at by the range of observation and experimentations that these people were doing. And this brings us to the main issue that we are concerned with here, that can we say that the period earlier than 17th century Europe was devoid of any such innovation or scientific development? Well, the answer is no, because incrementally, even in the times of Renaissance, we find some bit of technological innovations or scientific developments were already taking place. For example, you can see on your slide, water wheel was something which was an innovation during the Renaissance period itself, and it was extensively used. This technology was extensively used as an alternate source of energy, which conventionally was animate sources of energy. Now, it was changing it to some mechanical form. So, in the mining industry, in dams, and also in the paper industry, paper making industry, which actually had begun, this technology had begun in China, and it had come to Europe by around this time, by around 16th, 15th centuries, and Europeans were making good use of it. So, apart from that, we also have improvement in military and metallurgical industries. And for example, you can see as it's displayed on your slide, iron smelting, cannons, guns, molds, navigational tools, shipbuilding. All these are the requirements of the period, and that is where we should be mindful of this debate, that it is all rooted in the historical requirements of 16th century Europe. Anyone who is conversant with the history of 16th century Europe would understand what it meant. So, it is the absolutist monarchs, it is the time of overseas discoveries, it is the time of commercial capitalism taking strong roots. Europeans are moving to different parts of the globe, and they are trying to trade with them, and all these things required lot of iron implements, navigational tools, ships, cannons and guns to fight with the native people wherever they are going. Even they are fighting within themselves, they are fighting amongst themselves as well. Similarly, cartographical requirements, when you venture into the high seas and you have to discover new lands, new continents and so forth, new pieces of land. And so, you have to chart your course in the high seas, and you require maps, and map making is something which is of critical importance to 15th, 16th century sailors, and that required very minute observation. Also its presentation, its diagrammatic presentation with fair degree of accuracy, and that is where mathematical acumen, mathematical tools could have been used. And so, there is some kind of a social requirement for mathematics to emerge, and that is the argument of these historians. 17th century is also understood as the last stage of scientific developments before its commercial use, because once the range of implements and equipments and innovations are over, it was directly put to commercial profit, commercial use. Why? Because it is these people who are putting in money in these endeavors, and they want to make use of it. So that tells you about the backdrop in which these scientific innovations are happening. Similarly, if we look back to Renaissance period, we all know that Renaissance spurred search for truth, questioning religious bases, and linking of nature with humans. Humans were regarded as the best product of nature, best creation of nature, and nature was to be understood in a very accurate terms, not in some abstract way. The way it used to be earlier done by philosophers and so forth. So mathematics developed simultaneously, and you will discover that a lot of these polymaths who were the painters, sculptors or architects during the Renaissance period are very good in mathematical skills and so forth, and they are trying to capture, apprehend nature with fair degree of accuracy. They are trying to graphically recreate the way God created man or God created other creatures and other phenomena around themselves. Similarly, formulation, as I earlier said, was something which was the last link in the series of scientific methods after observation and experimentation, and that is something which was critically missing during the Renaissance period. But by the time we reach the 17th century, we have a good use of geometry. The theory of perspective had developed by around 17th century. Three-dimensional presentation on two-dimensional paper is something that had developed by around 17th century, and all these things required fair degree of sophisticated geometric information, and that accounts for the developments in geometry that was simultaneously happening, which was backing several other accurate presentations, be it maps or other representations of nature. Similarly, by the 16th century, printing of books had led to fair degree of advancement, particularly in medical sciences, because it came to create some kind of a correspondence with several other scholars working in different parts of Europe, and they could form some kind of a peer group within which they could discuss things, and they could diagrammatically publish their researches and share with other people who could subsequently comment on them and give critical assessment, which was so essential for any sophisticated research science led information creation. Similarly, by 16th and 17th century, European society had also needed the services of wise and practical scientists, and this again tells you about the political and social and economic requirements of 16th, 17th century Europe in terms of the historical agencies. Absolutist monarchs are coming up. They needed forts, they needed palaces. You will discover that these palaces are shifting from earlier locations to urban centers, because urbanism is another characterizing feature, as we shall discover in the subsequent slide. Florence needed military technocrats. Accurate maps for sea voyages were required for navigation purpose. New tools were required. Architecture demanded, and all these things are in fact the demand for all these things are getting created because of the emergence of absolute monarchies, because of the economic buoyancy that 16th century Europe is going through, the voyages that are being undertaken, the financing that is being done by different banking houses and bourgeoisie and so forth. So there is some kind of a demand which is historically generated, and science develops in response to that demand. So that's the argument that the historians and sociologists generally tend to give. This slide you can see growing urbanization. I have listed some of the cities like Seville, Lisbon, Antwerp, Paris, London. These are some of the cities in 16th century Europe that experienced tripling and at times quadrupling of their populations, and that as I was telling you earlier, created demands for more metals, mines, several other things. There are officials, there are learned people who are required to transact with the trading houses, the banks, the new financial instruments, and that could not be manned by conventional people, traditional people. So the absolutist monarchies are, or these kings are trying to invite people, and so there is fair degree of immigration of learned people to different European cities, and they are skilled people, they are skilled in financial vocabulary, they are bringing their own money and so forth, they are trying to earn profit out of it, and that created a different kind of vitality, economic vitality to 16th century Europe, and scientific developments that followed suit is sought to be understood in the same historical context. So, in effect, what I am trying to put across is that the ruling class needed scientific innovations and protected scientific developments because it was serving their interest. And hence, there is some kind of an embedded social, political and economic needs that the science or scientific developments at around this point of time was catering to. And by and large, this happens to be the overall scenario in which the scientific developments of 17th century Europe can be understood. Of course, this is not to deny the extraordinary leap of imagination that individuals in their personal capacity exhibited, the likes of Galileo, the likes of Copernicus, the likes of Bacon, René Descartes, Newton. Of course, you cannot count them out, and there is fair degree of contribution that these people in their individual capacity had to make. But the point that that is being asserted here is that all these things did not arise in vacuum. There was a historical context, and it could not have happened before Renaissance, it could not have happened before Reformation, it could not have happened prior to the church having lost its tight grip over the culture and attitude of European population. It could not have happened in the absence of the emergence of the bourgeoisie, which was backing these scientific developments, which was financing these scientific developments. It could not have emerged in the absence of the flourishing of or fast coming up of colleges, universities and research institutions and academies, which provided some kind of an institutional basis for the scientific efflorescence. It could not have happened because in the absence of the demands created, very tangible demands for steel, navigational tools, maps, etc. So the entire aesthetics and attitude and the intellectual climate also had a role to play, but in our lecture today, we have tried to demonstrate that there is a particular historical anchorage to what had happened in the 17th century Europe that we understand as scientific revolution. Thank you.